A single arrow cuts through torchlight over a battlefield in the Kulikoro Hills. It is not an ordinary arrow. Its shaft is plain wood, but its tip is carved from the spur of a white rooster. And the man riding toward it on a black horse believes with total conviction that no ordinary weapon on earth can touch him. He is wrong. The arrow finds him, and in that single moment, the man who built an empire out of iron and fear, who conquered 9 kingdoms, who was said to command spirits and read the future in cowrie shells, staggers for the first time in 30 years of unbroken conquest. His name is Sumanguru Kanté. The griots would call him a sorcerer. The Arab chroniclers who passed through his lands called him a tyrant. His enemies called him the Sosso bull. And by the time his story ends, a boy who could not even walk without dragging his legs across the dirt would rise up, defeat him, and build the greatest empire West Africa had ever seen on the ashes of everything Sumanguru created. This is his story. Not the villain of someone else's legend, but the king who very nearly made sure that legend was never told at all. The year is roughly 1180. Across the savanna grasslands of the Western Sudan, an empire is dying. Ghana, not the modern nation, but the ancient trading empire that had ruled the gold routes of West Africa for over 3 centuries, is crumbling. Its capital, Kumbi Saleh, once a city of merchants and mosques and markets that funneled gold north across the Sahara to feed the treasuries of the Mediterranean world, is fracturing under drought, rebellion, and the slow bleeding out of a state that has simply run out of time. Into this power vacuum steps a people called the Sosso, blacksmiths by trade and tradition, a caste whose relationship with iron and fire had for centuries carried both practical and spiritual weight in Mande society. In many West African cultures of this era, smiths occupied a strange dual position, essential to daily life, feared for their mastery of transformation, turning raw ore into tools and weapons through fire, and often believed to hold power that ordinary people did not, an inherited connection to forces beyond the visible world. Sumanguru Kanté is born into this world of smiths and spirits, and unlike most rulers whose legends soften their edges with time, his only grows sharper the further history moves from him. By the time he comes of age, Sumanguru is already something the Sosso have never quite had before, a leader with the ambition to stop being one power among many, and become the only power that matters. Around 1203 he made his move. Kumbi Saleh, the wounded, half-abandoned capital of the fallen Ghana Empire, falls to him. It is a symbolic strike as much as a military one. Whoever holds the old capital inherits, at least in the minds of the people, the mantle of everything Ghana once was. Sumanguru takes that mantle and does not let go. From there, he does not stop. Over the following 2 decades, Sumanguru conquers kingdom after kingdom across the Western Sudan. By some accounts, 9 separate states fall under Sosso authority. He centers his growing empire around the one resource his people have always understood better than anyone else: iron. Forges burn day and night in his fortified capital. Weapons, tools, and the instruments of a new kind of centralized power flow out from Sosso smiths, loyal only to him. And he builds something else too, something that will outlast even his empire. A capital city, heavily fortified, ringed with ramparts, home to royal forges that produce the finest ironwork in the region. It is a city built to say one thing to anyone who approaches it: there is no removing what has been built here. But conquest is only half of what makes Sumanguru's name endure. The other half, the half that turns a warlord into a legend, is what the griots of the Mande oral tradition would later weave around him: the belief that his power on the battlefield was not purely a matter of iron and men, The oral epic that would eventually be sung across generations of West African griots does not describe Sumanguru simply as a strong king. It describes a man wrapped in tana, a form of spiritual protection so complete that it was said no conventional weapon could kill him. Some versions of the story go further, describing him with 8 heads, the ability to transform his shape, a throne room where the walls themselves were said to be lined with the skulls of 9 defeated kings, and where snakes and scorpions moved freely as if they answered to him alone. He was said to consult occult forces before every campaign, to know outcomes before they happened, to read the intentions of enemies through divination before a single arrow was loosed. Now, a sober historian will tell you plainly that separating the real Sumanguru from the sorcerer of legend is, at this distance, close to impossible. Modern scholarship studying the griot performances that preserve his story increasingly reads these sorcerous details less as literal claims and more as a language, a way 13th century Mande storytellers described something that was very real and very dangerous: total, centralized, almost unaccountable political power. When a king's word cannot be challenged, when his enemies vanish, when his rule appears to bend fate itself in his favor, the people living under him reach for the only vocabulary large enough to describe it. They call it magic. But whatever the truth behind the legend, one thing both history and myth agree on completely: Sumanguru's rule was brutal. As his conquests reached deeper into Mande territory, he set his sights on one kingdom in particular, a small state called Kangaba, ruled by a Malinke king named Nare Magan. When Sumanguru's forces overran it, he did something designed to make absolutely certain no rival royal line would ever rise to challenge him again. Of the king's sons, by most tellings 12 of them, Sumanguru had 11 put to death. He spared exactly one, not out of mercy. According to the oral tradition, he spared the last son precisely because the boy seemed like no threat at all. This child could not walk. His legs, weak and malformed since infancy, dragged uselessly beneath him when he tried to move. He crawled where other children ran. The court whispered that he might never speak properly, let alone lead an army. Sumanguru looked at this crippled prince and saw nothing worth killing. The boy's name was Mari Jata. History would remember him by another name entirely, Sundiata Keita. Sumanguru left him alive because a king who cannot stand, cannot raise a sword, cannot mount a horse, cannot lead men into battle. It was, by every rational measure of the time, the safest possible decision. Kill the strong sons who might one day gather warriors against you. Let the broken one live out his days as a footnote, a cautionary tale about the fragility of royal blood, a living reminder to the Mande people of exactly how thoroughly they had been conquered. It was the single greatest miscalculation of Sumanguru Kanté's life. Because while the Sosso king turned his attention to the next kingdom, the next tribute payment, the next demonstration of power designed to keep an entire region too terrified to resist him, that crawling boy was not fading away in some forgotten corner of the empire. He was watching, he was enduring, and with the help of a mother who refused to accept that her son's story was already finished, he was, very slowly, learning to stand. Sumanguru's grip on the Western Sudan, meanwhile, tightened into something closer to tyranny than rule. Reports described crushing taxation, gold, food, livestock, and most humiliatingly, the forced surrender of the most beautiful women of conquered peoples, taken as tribute to the Sosso court. Entire communities were stripped of their harvests and their dignity in the same stroke. Villages that had once traded freely across the gold routes now existed to feed a war machine that showed no sign of slowing down. And here is the detail that matters most for understanding everything that comes next. Oppression, when it is total enough and lasts long enough, does not just create fear. It creates hunger, a hunger spreading quietly from village to village for someone, anyone, who might finally stand up to the Sosso bull. The people of the Western Sudan did not know it yet, but the deliverer they were praying for was already alive. He was hundreds of miles away, exiled from his own homeland, still years from being able to walk without support, let alone lead an army. But somewhere in a foreign court, a boy who Sumanguru Kanté had judged too broken to matter was beginning to stand on legs no one believed would ever hold him. Sumanguru had made his empire feared from Kumbi Saleh to the edges of the Mande heartland. He had built a capital ringed in iron and myth. He believed, with the same total conviction that would one day walk him toward a rooster spur arrow on a battlefield in Kirina, that there was no one left in the world capable of taking any of it from him. He was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. While Sumanguru Kanté sat on a throne, some said was ringed with the skulls of 9 conquered kings, the boy he had judged too broken to matter was crossing the savannah on a mother's back. Sogolon Keju, Sundiata's mother, remembered in the epic as a woman of extraordinary will, sometimes called the Buffalo Woman for a hunter's prophecy tied to her name, refused to accept the future the Sosso king had assigned her son. When Kangaba fell fully under Sumanguru's shadow and the surviving royal family's position became untenable, she gathered her children and went into exile rather than watch her crippled son become a permanent hostage to someone else's mercy. For years, they moved from court to court across the region, never fully welcoming, never fully safe, a fallen prince and his mother living on the goodwill of foreign kings. And for years, Sundiata could not walk. He dragged himself across the packed earth of strange courtyards, while other children his age trained with spears. The other exiled nobles around him whispered the same thing the Sosso already believed, that whatever this boy had once been destined for, iron legs and a warlord's empire, had already closed that door for good. Sundiata refused to accept it. According to oral tradition, he had blacksmiths forge iron braces for his legs, a bitter, almost poetic detail, given that iron was the very metal that had built Sumanguru's empire and taken his brothers' lives. Gripping an iron rod, dragging the braces beneath him, the boy who could not stand began, inch by inch, day by agonizing day, to pull himself upright. The stories say the earth itself seemed to bend to help him, that he planted his hands in the soil and rose from it like a tree finding its roots. Strip away the poetry, and the underlying truth is no less remarkable. A child everyone had written off, through sheer refusal to accept his own ending, willed himself back onto his feet. By his teenage years, Sundiata was not merely walking, he was hunting, training, and leading. He arrived eventually at the court of the king of Mema, a ruler impressed enough by the young exile's growing reputation for courage and intelligence that he named him viceroy, trusted to govern in the king's absence. The boy Sumanguru had spared, because he seemed harmless, was, without anyone in Sosso territory quite noticing, becoming a genuinely formidable young leader with real administrative experience, a growing following, and a burning, patient hatred for the man who had murdered his brothers and driven his family from their home. Sumanguru, meanwhile, had never stopped tightening his grip. By the early 1230s, his authority stretched across the Western Sudan, almost unchallenged. Back in Kangaba, Sundiata's half-brother Dankaran Tuman, installed on the throne in Sundiata's absence, had chosen the path of least resistance, submitting to Sosso authority rather than risk Sumanguru's wrath. The Mande people found themselves paying the same crushing tribute as every other conquered territory: gold, grain, livestock, and their pride, extracted year after year by a king whose forges never stopped burning. And it is here that another figure enters the epic, one whose story reveals just how far Sumanguru's cruelty had begun to poison even his own inner circle. Fakoli Koroma was a nephew of Sumanguru's, a powerful war chief in his own right, married to a woman renowned across the region for her cooking. So renowned, in fact, that Sumanguru, in an act of pure entitlement, took her from Fakoli for his own household. It was the kind of casual, absolute abuse of power that a man surrounded by nothing but submission eventually starts to believe is simply his right. Fakoli did not forgive it. Bound up with this insult, in the version of the epic told by generations of griots, is one of the story's most treasured details. Sumanguru possessed a magical balafon, a wooden xylophone said to be enchanted, capable of summoning powers no ordinary instrument could touch, an object as central to his mystique as any weapon in his armory. When the breach between Sumanguru and his own nephew became irreparable, Fakoli did something almost unthinkable. He crept into the heart of Sosso power and stole the balafon outright, carrying away not just an instrument, but a piece of Sumanguru's very legend, before defecting entirely to the growing resistance. It was a small theft with enormous symbolic weight. If the mightiest sorcerer king in the Western Sudan could be robbed of his own magic by a man from inside his own household, then perhaps, just perhaps, he was not as untouchable as 30 years of conquest had convinced everyone, including himself, that he was. Word of Fakoli's defection traveled fast, and it traveled all the way to Mema, where a young viceroy with iron-strengthened legs and a decade of exile behind him understood exactly what it meant. The wall of fear that had kept every neighboring kingdom too terrified to act against Sumanguru was beginning, for the first time in a generation, to crack. Sundiata made his decision. It was time to go home. He returned not as a beggar or a forgotten exile, but as a man who had spent years quietly building relationships, credibility, and military experience in a foreign court. And as he moved back toward his homeland, something remarkable happened. Kingdom after kingdom that had spent decades paying tribute to Sumanguru under gritted teeth began, cautiously and then not so cautiously, to rally to him. Chiefs who had never met each other, tribes who had nothing in common except a shared exhaustion with Sosso rule, found in this returning prince the first real chance in a generation to do something other than submit. Among those who joined him was his own half-sister, Nana Triban, and her role in what follows is one of the epic's most quietly extraordinary threads. Nana Triban had been taken into Sumanguru's own household, one among the women claimed as tribute from conquered families. Rather than a life defined purely by that captivity, tradition holds that she used her position at the very center of Sumanguru's court for something else entirely: intelligence. Living inside the walls of the man who had destroyed her family, she watched, listened, and, critically, worked to learn the one secret Sumanguru had always protected more fiercely than his gold or his throne: the nature of his Tana, the source of his supernatural invincibility, and the single weakness that lay hidden inside it. Every version of the story frames this detail slightly differently, but the through line stays constant. For all his conquered kingdoms and skull-lined throne room, Sumanguru's power rested on a secret. And the moment that secret found its way out of his own household and into the hands of the woman plotting his downfall from within his own walls, his reign was already, unknowingly, finished. By 1234, Sundiata's growing coalition entered Jeriba, the Kangaba capital, and he took the throne that had been stolen from his family a generation earlier. It was a bold move, and a dangerous one, because taking Jeriba was not the same as defeating Sosso power. It was, in effect, a declaration. Sundiata was no longer a quiet threat, operating from the shadows of a foreign court. He was standing in the open, claiming a throne, and daring the most feared king in the Western Sudan to come and take it back from him. Sumanguru did not need to be dared twice. For 30 years, no coalition had dared to form against him with any real staying power. Rebellions had flared and been crushed. Kings had grumbled and paid their tribute anyway. But something was different this time, and even Sumanguru, sorcerer, tyrant, conqueror of 9 kingdoms, could feel it. The whispers reaching his court described not a scattered uprising he could stamp out village by village, but a genuine alliance. Malinke chiefs, disaffected vassals, and his own blood relative Fakoli, all rallying under a single banner, a single name, that of the crippled boy he had let live because he seemed too broken to ever matter. He assembled his forces. Whatever fear or uncertainty moved through the Sosso court in those final weeks before open war, Sumanguru himself gave no outward sign of doubt. He had built an empire on the conviction that he was untouchable, that no ordinary blade, no ordinary army, no ordinary man could bring him down. 30 years of unbroken conquest had given him no reason to believe otherwise. The two forces began converging on a stretch of land near a town called Kirina, in what is now the Koulikoro region of Mali. On one side, Sumanguru Kanté, the Sosso bull, sorcerer king, master of iron, and by every account his people believed, master of forces beyond the visible world. On the other, Sundiata Keita, once a crawling child left for dead by political calculation, now a coalition leader, carrying the accumulated grievance of an entire region on his shoulders. Both men, in their own way, believed they carried destiny with them onto that field. Only one of them was right. What happened next would not just end a reign, it would end an era, and begin one of the most consequential empires in the history of West Africa, built directly on the ground where the Sorcerer King's magic finally, fatally, failed him. The two armies met on the plain near Kirina, sometime around 1235. On one side, the coalition Sundiata has spent years building Malinke warriors, defected Sosso commanders led by the vengeful Fakoli, chiefs from a dozen small kingdoms who have finally found a cause worth uniting behind. On the other hand, Sumanguru Kanté's forces, still vast, still battle-hardened by 30 years of conquest, still commanded by a king who has never once in his life watched an enemy walk away from him victorious. By the oral tradition's account, this is not simply two armies clashing. It is two kinds of power meeting in the open, the accumulated, brutal, unbroken dominance of a man who built an empire on fear against the improbable, patient will of a boy the world had already buried once and who refused to stay buried. The fighting is fierce from the first charge. Sumanguru's warriors, disciplined by decades of campaigning, press hard against Sundiata's newer, more fractured coalition. For a long stretch of the battle, the outcome is genuinely uncertain. This is not a rout, not a foregone conclusion, despite what hindsight makes it feel like. Sundiata's forces hold their ground through sheer will, through the accumulated fury of years spent paying tribute to a man they never chose to serve. And then Sundiata does something that changes everything. Before the battle, through the intelligence quietly gathered by his half-sister, Nana Triban, during her years inside Sumanguru's own household, Sundiata has learned the one secret the Sosso king guarded more closely than his gold, the true nature of his Tana. Every powerful figure in the Mande spiritual world, tradition holds, carries a totem, a specific animal or object tied to their protection, and, if discovered by an enemy, to their undoing. Sumanguru's protection, the secret revealed, was bound to something almost absurdly ordinary, the spur of a white rooster. Ordinary iron, ordinary spearheads, ordinary arrows, none of it could touch him. 30 years of battlefields had apparently proven that much true, but an arrow tipped, however humbly, with a white rooster's spur, could pierce the invincibility that no army had ever managed to break through force alone. Sundiata has prepared exactly such an arrow. In the chaos of the battle, as Sumanguru rides through the fighting with the same total confidence that has carried him through 9 conquered kingdoms, the arrow finds him. It does not need to be a fatal wound to be a devastating one. The epic tradition describes it as enough to wound him, to break the aura of invincibility he has worn like armor for 3 decades. And the moment it happens, something shifts across the entire battlefield that no strategy alone could have caused. Because here is the terrible truth about power built on myth. It only works as long as everyone, including the man at the center of it, believes it cannot be broken. The instant Sumanguru Kanté bleeds, the instant his own warriors see the wound, see him falter, see the invincible king proven, finally, mortal, the psychological foundation of his entire empire cracks in the space of a single moment. Sumanguru's forces, who moments earlier were fighting with the confidence of an army that has never truly lost, begin to break. Sundiata's coalition, sensing the shift, pressed harder. What had been an uncertain, grinding battle turns, in a matter of minutes, into a collapse. Sumanguru himself does not die on the field at Kirina, not in the versions of the story griots have carried furthest across the centuries. Wounded, exposed, and watching his army disintegrate around him, he flees. He rides for the mountains of Kulikoro, disappearing into the same rugged country his ancestors once used to build a kingdom out of nothing, and the historical record simply loses him there. Some traditions say he died alone in the hills, undone at last by the very isolation he had inflicted on so many conquered peoples. Others claim he vanished into legend entirely, transforming, fittingly, for a man whose whole mythology was built on transformation, into stone, or spirit, or simply into silence. No grave has ever been confirmed. No definitive account of his final hours exists. The Sosso bull, who had ruled the Western Sudan for over 3 decades, who had built a fortified capital ringed with royal forges, who had conquered 9 kingdoms and taxed a region into submission, walks off the pages of confirmed history and directly into myth. The same myth he had spent his life half-believing protected him. What happened at Kirina did not just end one man's reign. It ended an era. With Sumanguru broken and the Sosso kingdom's grip shattered, Sundiata marched his coalition onward, and within a matter of months, the old Sosso capital fell as well, effectively erasing the empire Sumanguru had spent his entire adult life constructing. In its place, Sundiata Keita began building something new, not simply a replacement kingdom, but a genuinely different kind of state. According to tradition, in the aftermath of Kirina, he gathered the chiefs and clans of his coalition together and established the Kurukan Fuga, a founding charter distributing authority, defining rights, and binding the newly united territories into a single political order under his rule from a rebuilt capital at Niani. That order became the Mali Empire, which would go on to become the largest and wealthiest state West Africa had yet seen, its later rulers, most famously Mansa Musa, carrying gold across the world in quantities that would echo in historical memory for centuries. None of it would have existed in the form it took without Sumanguru Kanté. Not because he built it, but because everything Sundiata created was, in a very real sense, built as the deliberate opposite of everything Sumanguru had been. Here is the part of this story worth sitting with. Every empire that endures needs a founding myth, and founding myths need a villain large enough to make the hero's rise mean something. Sumanguru Kanté became, in the retelling that mattered most to the people who survived him, the Mande oral tradition passed down by griots for 800 years, precisely that villain: 8 heads, a throne room lined with skulls, snakes and scorpions obedient to his will. A secret so dangerous it took a spy inside his own household years to uncover it. Modern scholarship studying these griot performances increasingly reads the sorcery not as literal claim, but as language, a way an oppressed and terrified population found to describe the genuinely unaccountable nature of absolute, centralized power. When a ruler's enemies simply disappear, when resistance withers before it can organize, when one man's will seems to bend the outcome of every conflict in his favor for 30 straight years, Sorcerer may be less a supernatural accusation than the most honest word available for something that felt, to the people living under it, indistinguishable from magic. That reading does not erase the darker, well-documented parts of Sumanguru's rule: the crushing tribute, the murdered princes, the women taken as spoils, the neighboring kingdoms conquered one after another until an entire region existed, largely to feed one man's ambition. Whatever supernatural elements the epic layered onto him over centuries of retelling, the underlying political reality, total domination maintained through fear, required no magic at all to be devastating. And this is, in the end, what makes Sumanguru Kanté worth remembering on his own terms, rather than purely as the obstacle in someone else's origin story. He was not a footnote invented to make Sundiata's rise more dramatic. He was a real king who built a real empire out of a real, dying world, who understood, decades before Sundiata ever stood on his own legs, exactly how fragile power in the post-Ghana Sahel had become, and who moved faster and more ruthlessly than anyone else to seize it. His reign lasted over 30 years. That is not the record of a minor tyrant swept aside by destiny. That is the record of one of the most capable and most feared rulers West Africa produced in the entire medieval period. Undone, in the end, not by fate, but by the one crippled boy he judged too broken to bother killing. There is a bitter irony sitting at the very center of this story, and it is worth naming plainly. Sumanguru's downfall began the moment he decided mercy towards Sundiata cost him nothing. He was almost certainly right, by every rational calculation available to him at the time. A child who could not walk posed no threat that any king in the 13th century needed to take seriously. What he could not calculate, what no amount of iron or fear or spiritual protection tied to a rooster's spur could have prepared him for, was that the boy would simply refuse to stay broken. That refusal is the actual engine of this entire epic. Not magic, not destiny handed down from the heavens, a wounded family's stubborn will to survive a conqueror's mercy and turn it, eventually, into his undoing. Sumanguru Kanté vanished into the Kulikoro Hills roughly 800 years ago, and no one alive today can tell you with certainty where he died or how. But his name has never disappeared. Griots still sing his story in villages across Mali and Guinea. Historians still argue over how much of his legend is metaphor and how much might be memory of something we've simply lost the context to understand. And every time the epic of Sundiata is performed, at a naming ceremony, a wedding, a gathering meant to remind a new generation where their people came from, Sumanguru rides onto that stage again, Sorcerer King, Iron Ruler, the obstacle destiny needed in order to prove itself. Fears, defeated, never quite forgotten. Be like Sundiata, the griots say when the story ends. Rise, no matter how thoroughly the world has already written you off. But remember too, what Sumanguru's own story quietly insists on, that empires built purely on fear, however unbreakable they appear, are only ever one unnoticed exile away from finding the exact weapon that can finally bring them down. This has been Forgotten Kings. I'll see you in the next episode.